All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. We're really excited to be joining you as part of the activities for Climate Week NYC 2020 here in the final day. My name is David Parham. I'm the Director of Research Projects here at SASB, and we very much appreciate you joining us for this session in which we'll be doing a technical deep dive on the financial materiality of climate risk and the important role that disclosure plays in driving change. So for today's agenda, pretty straightforward. First, I'll start off with a very brief presentation to set us up for the panel, diving into how we account for climate risk. Next, we'll jump into our panel session with members of the SASB research team to do a deep dive on climate risk in the SASB standards. And then finally, we'll do our best to preserve some time at the end to take some questions from all of you in the audience for our panelists. Sorry, bear with me here. Before proceeding, I wanted to quickly point you to some functionality associated with our GoToWebinar platform. As mentioned, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions to the panelists during the panel. In order to do so, please look for the questions box as part of the GoToWebinar control panel. You can go ahead and type your questions in there and then click send to submit them. Given the number of participants we do have this morning, we may not be able to respond to all the questions we receive, but we will do our best to monitor your questions as they come in. So let's go ahead and dive in. To set the stage for our panel, I wanted to provide a quick overview of how SASB accounts for climate risk in our standards. And first off, for those of you who may not be familiar with SASB, I'll give just a very quick overview. SASB, or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, is a nonprofit standard setting organization for financially material ESG information. Our mission is to connect businesses and investors on the financial impacts of sustainability. And we do this through the establishment of our 77 industry-specific disclosure standards, which are used by companies and investors globally. So let's now zoom in and talk a little bit about how SASB accounts for climate risk. First, what do we mean by climate risk? And I think we take an approach that'll be very familiar with folks in the audience, defining three broad categories for climate-related risks. First, there's physical climate risk, which is focused on both the chronic and acute physical impacts of the changing climate, including increasing global temperatures, rising sea levels, increasing storm frequency and severity, and other physical factors. Then there's transition risks, which are the risks that arise from the transition to a lower carbon economy, including technology and market changes. And finally, regulatory risk, which include policy actions that attempt to constrain actions that contribute to climate change. These, of course, are very analogous to the risk categorizations described by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Second, each of these risks will impact economic actors in different ways depending on the activities of those economic actors. So heavy emitters will likely be more exposed to potential regulatory risk, targeting, limiting those emissions. Actors heavily reliant on land use may be more exposed to forms of physical risk, and actors whose products consume large amounts of energy, for example, may be disproportionately impacted by transition risk. So these varying risk exposures, depending on the activities of the economic actor, are a key reason why SASB takes an industry-specific approach to standard setting. Depending on the properties of a given industry, different forms of climate risk will be more or less tied to financial impacts. And then third, depending on the specific way in which a given industry is exposed to and subsequently manages climate risk, the way that performance gets measured will vary, ranging from measuring emissions to energy or fuel usage to water usage or other types of performance measurement. So let's take a look at a specific example here. The economic actor, for example, is someone in the metals and mining industry. In this case, the industry is characterized by high emissions, indicating a transition risk exposure, and this risk exposure can be measured through the company's direct emissions. Industry is also a heavy user of energy in the form of imported electricity, and thus is exposed to transition risk, which can be measured through Scope 2 emissions or directly through its energy usage. And then finally, the industry is dependent on the use of a large amount of water as part of its extractive activities, and the availability of which is of course tied to physical climate risk and can be measured through the characteristics of that company's water usage. To conclude, as a reminder, there's three key concepts I just wanted to quickly lay the foundation with here. First, that there are different types of climate risk: physical risk, transition risk, regulatory risk. Second, that the financial materiality of that risk exposure will vary by industry, as we've depicted here, showing different industries and different channels of risk exposure. And then third, that the way that we measure performance on climate risk can vary by industry. Here we're looking at different industries that are all exposed to physical climate risk, and then the associated SASB metrics. And just to pick out one example, physical risk exposure in the healthcare delivery industry, which focuses on the impacts of the changing climate on the prevalence of certain diseases, is of course different than physical risk exposure in the hotels industry, which for example could impact properties that are increasingly exposed to extreme weather events such as flooding. So we've discussed a bit of the importance of performance measurement. In this next example, which we're calling the tale of two companies, I want to touch on another important point: the fact that a mix of information is needed to fully understand how companies are exposed to different types of climate risk and how disclosure can provide decision useful information about these risk exposures. So let's look at two theoretical companies. Company A and Company B are both companies in the metals and mining industry. And for this simple thought experiment, let's assume that they both operate with a similar geographic footprint and both extract a similar mix of commodities. Both companies have direct Scope 1 emissions, and let's assume they report this in accordance with the SASB standards, and this speaks to their regulatory risk exposure. In addition, both companies are reliant on imported energy and therefore have a significant amount of indirect or Scope 2 emissions. So first, let's go ahead and directly look at that, at each company's reported Scope 2 emissions. In this case, they're quite similar. Absent any other information, one might conclude that they have a similar level of risk exposure to the risk posed by this reliance on imported energy, and that the emissions represented by that energy usage. However, you can probably guess that there's more to this picture and why a mix of decision useful information is needed to really understand how each company is exposed to climate risk, and importantly, its management response to that risk exposure. So the next thing we'll look at is the annual production of each company. So here you can see that Company A is producing about 4 times the amount of the commodity metal that Company B is. And already this is starting to suggest that something must be going on that differentiates these companies, given their comparable Scope 2 emissions. Next, we can see that the energy usage of each company. So here you can observe that Company A uses a significant amount more energy than Company B. And that makes sense given the larger production of Company A. Interestingly, you can observe that Company B appears to be a little bit less efficient in their use of energy per unit of production. And this all suggests, of course, that something must differentiate these companies and their energy management strategies. Consistent with the previous slide, we can now see a key difference between the two companies. So here, Company A is only sourcing about 30% of its energy from the electrical grid, whereas Company B is sourcing about 90% of its energy from the grid. And this, of course, tells us something important. This connects directly through to that Scope 2 emissions number, which are the emissions associated with this external energy usage. But it still begs the question why these numbers are so different. Here we see the key missing piece. So Company A has installed and sources a significant amount of energy from its owned and operated renewable wind-based energy generation. This, of course, explains the significant difference in aggregate energy use, but the relatively similar Scope 2 emissions. Both are sourcing about the same amount of energy from the electrical grid, even though their aggregate energy use is quite different. But I think we're still missing one really important piece of information, which is why these companies have diverged so significantly and how we can think about that from a climate risk perspective. So that's the last bit of information here, which is that the companies have taken two very different strategies to manage climate risk, represented by their reliance on energy to support production. Company A has adopted a strategy to invest CapEx in renewable energy generation to diversify its energy usage away from grid reliance. And Company A clearly believes this is the right strategy for it to mitigate the risk of potential additional costs that it may incur as regulations come into place that put a price on emissions. Company B, on the other hand, has adopted a different approach. It has chosen to focus on making energy efficiency improvements to minimize its energy usage per unit of production. As we saw earlier in this section, the company right now is less energy efficient than Company A, so it likely has some low-hanging fruit here. So these different strategic approaches help provide the final piece of information that paints a complete picture about how each company is exposed to climate risk, as well as how it is managing that risk. And that's really the point of this thought experiment. For investors, this mix of information is critical. Each of the data points listed here is one piece of a puzzle that is needed for an investor to understand each company's exposure to climate risk, represented by its energy usage, and its strategy to manage and mitigate that risk. So fortunately, we have a set of frameworks and standards that are designed to provide investors with exactly this set of information. So for that critical qualitative context, the TCFD provides a framework for how companies can effectively disclose how climate impacts their strategy, in addition to governance and risk management. For that broadly applicable industry agnostic data, such as scope 2 emissions, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides a way that all companies can calculate this in a comparable way. And then standards like the GRI standards can really help facilitate disclosure in a comparable and standardized manner. And then for that industry-specific layer of data, the SASB standards help build out that fuller picture, including the amount of commodity produced, the amount of energy used to accomplish this, and the percentage of such energy that was sourced from renewable sources. So now that we've kind of laid the foundation there, discussing the importance of having that mix of financially material, decision useful information, let's zoom back a little bit and think about the ways in which we can drive climate action through capital markets. And to explore this, we're going to look at how value chains are connected and how decisions at different points along the value chain have a significant impact on the total emissions across a value chain. And we like to call this study the life of a carbon molecule. So in this example, we're going to focus on two questions. Number one, how do the decisions of economic actors result in emissions? And then number two, how can the SASB standards help companies and investors understand these decisions and their upstream and downstream implications? So let's take our old friend, creatively named Company A, which we now know is a heavy user of energy. And this is a very simple depiction of a segment in a value chain. So we have a power generator that is producing electrical energy. That energy is then consumed by Company A. And in generating that power generator combusts natural gas, let's say, and produces CO2 emissions. So this is a very simple model, and it's clear that Company A's decisions that affect its energy usage are therefore connected to how much CO2 gets emitted by the power generator. Again, thinking of our previous example, we know that Company A has decided to deploy CapEx to install self-generated renewable energy. That results in a decrease in the power that it imports from the electrical grid and its associated costs. If we look at the power generator, we of course observe that this decline in energy demand results in less energy generated, less natural gas burned, and ultimately less CO2 emitted. So in this simple model, those carbon molecules in the form of natural gas remain sequestered in their natural gas reservoir unproduced. And the SASB standards for the power generation industry, as well as that for the metals and mining industry, provide you with these relevant data points at each point along the value chain. So as we increasingly think about value chain integration, this of course becomes quite a bit more complicated, but the SASB standards can help to make this more manageable by providing the necessary financially material data at each point along the value chain. So let's start at the beginning of a value chain, looking at an oil and gas reservoir. The hydrocarbon reserves sitting in that reservoir, of course, represent potential emissions if they're ultimately produced and enter the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. Now, a series of downstream decisions ultimately will determine whether that occurs. The decision to produce that amount of oil and gas, of course, has its own impact on direct emissions, given that extractive activities require energy. The SASB standards help account for this. Those little two blue boxes, for example, include recommended disclosures around that extractive company's direct emissions. There's also a metric that points to whether those reserves will ultimately be produced, depending on a range of scenarios. And that, of course, is a key variable that we're seeking to understand. Now let's move a little further downstream to the refining industry. Again, the refiner generates emissions due to the energy required to refine hydrocarbons, and these emissions are impacted based on the decisions the refiner makes. For example, what type of crude it sources and the varying level of energy required to process that crude into fuel. Now we don't show it here, but we also have a metric that describes the extent to which a refiner has opted to produce renewable fuels, another possible climate mitigation strategy. And then let's move one more step downstream to automobile manufacturers. Now, auto manufacturers need to consider their exposure to transition risk in the form of consumer demand for increasingly fuel efficient or zero emission vehicles. There's also increasing regulatory risk associated with this issue. So in response, companies are adopting different strategies with respect to the suite of products that they're developing and will ultimately offer to their consumers. And that's what the SASB metric is focused on, is for a given auto company, what does its product mix look like? How fuel efficient are those vehicles? How many zero emission vehicles is it producing for its consumers? Importantly, the decisions of the automaker in response to consumer demand and increasing regulatory pressure around their product design has significant implications within this value chain. And so if we look at the end of the value chain, we're looking at ultimately tailpipe emissions from the vehicles when they're out on the road. And from the perspective of an oil and gas company, this of course represents scope 3 emissions. The factors that I mentioned to you that impact such emissions, such as the fuel efficiency of the vehicles and the increasing production of zero emission vehicles, start to move upstream and impact the demand for refined products, directly impacting those refiners. But the impacts, of course, don't stop there and ultimately extend back to the oil and gas production company in the form of reduced demand for hydrocarbons, which has the potential to impact the price of the commodity and therefore the economic viability of producing that molecule of carbon out of that reservoir. So we have two really important effects here. Number one, reduced demand might result in that carbon molecule staying in the reservoir, staying sequestered. And number two, all the energy consumed along the value chain to get that carbon molecule out of the ground and into a form that can be used in an automobile have been avoided. But what's important is that each point along the value chain, each of the company's decisions that influence whether that carbon molecule gets liberated are each industry specific. So for the oil company, they can choose to produce or not produce that hydrocarbon asset. For the refiner, it can choose to change its product mix based on downstream demand, or perhaps even increasingly shift to renewable fuels. And for the automaker, it has strategic decisions to make around its R&D pipeline based on emerging regulation and shifting consumer demand toward more fuel efficient or lower emission vehicles. So that's where SASB comes in, is we really help investors understand and answer these questions at each point along the value chain. And we help companies to report effectively to those investors. And so given each of these represent potentially financially material risk, this helps investors make decisions accordingly, which in aggregate can powerfully influence this value chain to drastically reduce emissions in response to these emerging climate risks. So that's what we refer to as this life of a carbon molecule. I'd love to spend more time diving into this value chain as I find it really interesting, but in the interest of time, I want to get to our panelists. So we'll say that we do have an article that we're developing that will dive into this in more depth, which we're happy to share once it's available. But this is a complicated but important idea, and the SASB standards help illuminate the decisions that companies make at each point along the value chain that impact emissions. and then provide investors with important information to manage aggregate climate risk across the value chain. And that's really the concept, this pervasiveness but industry specificity of climate risk that I'm really excited to dive into with our panel. So let's not delay any further, and I'd love to introduce our panelists. We have Gail Glazerman, who is our analyst and sector lead for resource transformation and renewable resources, as well as covering many issues related to the transportation sector. We have Lynn Shaw, our lead analyst and sector lead for food and beverage. And we have Marvin Smith, our director of stakeholder outreach. Thank you all for joining us today. So let's go ahead and jump in. And as a reminder to folks in the audience, please do feel free to submit any questions you have for our panelists via that questions box. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead and jump in with some questions for each of you. So maybe Gail and Lynn, we can start with you. And we'd just love to kind of dive in and unpack that industry specificity a little bit more. So maybe you could each describe the sector and industries that you cover, and then what are some of the industry-specific ways that climate risk shows up in the sectors and industries that you cover? So maybe Gail, we can start with you.
Sure, absolutely. So I cover, as David mentioned, renewable resources and alternative energy, resource transformation and transportation to some extent. Renewable resources and resource transformation incorporate some non-extractive materials such as chemicals and paper, as well as some industrial industries such as machinery and aerospace. And these issues do manifest quite differently across different industries. Some of it is materially different and some of it is perhaps a little bit more subtle. So looking at some of the transportation industries, for instance, there are some global regulations on carbon emissions that are going to be phased in over the next several years for airlines. And airlines can meet those restrictions in several ways, including some operational differences which reduce emissions, investing in new aircraft which can reduce emissions, but ultimately they can also buy carbon offsets, at least in the interim. Taking a look at the marine industry, there are restrictions on sulfur emissions, and companies are meeting that by either using a different fuel, a low sulfur fuel, or investing in CapEx to scrub their emissions. So it's subtle, similar type of restrictions, but a subtle way it's manifesting. Looking at an industry like forestry management, climate change adaptation is a topic within our standards. And if you just think of some of the recent news from the US over the last couple of weeks with forest fires and drought in the out west and severe tropical storm activity in the south, those issues can have implications for forests. And also warmer weather can leave trees more exposed to insect infestations. A heavy storm can make it hard to access your trees, but it can also knock down trees and do considerable damage. It's certainly worth pointing out most of the forest fires we're hearing about lately are not in the managed forests in the US, but still it creates significant risk. So that's a very, very different manifestation than just regulating emissions for some other industries I cover.
Perfect. Thank you, Gail. All great examples. And maybe Lynn, over to you for some of the examples from the sector that you cover.
Sure. And as David mentioned, I cover the food and beverage sector, which includes all the industries along the food value chain, from your agricultural product producers down to the retailers, as well as the tobacco industry. I think for the food and beverage sector, probably for many in the audience, a lot of the risks around climate change, it's more well known. It touches the consumers around the agricultural supply chain, which makes up around 10 to 15% of our total global greenhouse gas emissions. This is a sector where the risks from climate change are certainly high. I think what is interesting to think about is often we focus on the E, the environmental and physical impacts from climate change for the food and beverage sector. So you look at water scarcity, water management issues. You look at potentially ingredient sourcing risks from both acute and chronic physical impacts over time. But I think the part that's interesting to think about also is there is a large social impact and issue for the sector as well around climate change. There are millions of small-scale farmers, agricultural workers along the supply chain around the world. And I think one thing you see companies, investors in this industry start to really grapple with is the impact of managing these supply chains, these suppliers, as climate really changes. So not only this environmental, physical element, but actually a big social element as well.
That's really helpful. And I think that's what really interesting to hear both of your responses and sort of thinking about, you can hear sort of that value chain idea come through in your responses, and that there are direct impacts to companies directly within the value chain, and then there's that important connectivity to upstream and downstream actors. And it's complicated, but that's where the SASB standards are trying to get to those disclosures that are most decision useful, to help unpack that for investors and to help companies communicate that. Marvin, maybe let's turn to you. So I think, you know, in your role as director of stakeholder outreach, you're very much interacting with the market all the time. People that are disclosing using the standards, investors that are using the information. And obviously market feedback is a big piece of how our standards get developed and maintained over time. I'd love to hear, so in your interactions with folks in the market, what's some of the feedback that you've been hearing that we've been getting around climate risk, the SASB standards, and what folks are hoping to accomplish in terms of disclosure?
Yeah, thanks, David. You know, I really appreciated your tale of two companies, because I get a lot of questions around Scope 2 metrics and why we don't have them featured in the SASB standards. And I think, as you illustrated, it really just comes down to the fact that Scope 2 metrics alone don't really tell the whole story, right? So in any metric that's in the SASB standards, it needs to tell a complete story around a company's decisions. And going back to your example, a company that invests in energy efficiency as opposed to CapEx for renewables might in the future find itself in a bind if they kind of need to further reduce costs, but have already kind of squeezed out all the benefits afforded by energy efficiency. So at present, our research and consultation that we've conducted thus far hasn't pointed to Scope 2 emissions as the right metric for SASB, which is focused on the financial impacts of business decisions. However, like with any issue, if we see increasing investor demand and more evidence of financial impact, and it's clear that there's an opportunity to develop cost-effective indicators for companies to report that provide decision-useful information to investors, that's something we'd want to hear from the market, and we could incorporate as part of our ongoing research and standard setting activities. So I'm sure I'll touch on that more later on in our conversation in terms of how individuals can actually get engaged with that process. Another thing that I hear often are questions from stakeholders wondering why certain physical climate risks related elements aren't in the SASB standards. And actually, in many cases, I think those elements are captured, just not in a way that is maybe as intuitive to the stakeholder that's asking, because we have a specific lens through which we look at the issue. So just to give you a concrete example, if you take you want to understand climate impacts for the apparel industry, and you look at the environmental dimension in SASB's materiality map, you won't see anything there. But a lot of these impacts can be found under the business model and innovation dimension. So these are indicators that are calling for companies' descriptions of environmental and social risks associated with the sourcing of materials. And these environmental and social risks do include climate change impacts, right? So it could be climate change impacts that lead to water stress or reduced crop yields, which in turn will impact the price and availability of resources. It could also be elements of land use practices within the supply chain that will also affect the yields. And there are regulatory risks as well, right? If there is legislation around greenhouse gases, that could in turn affect the price of petroleum-derived raw materials for the apparel industry. So that's all to say that there are a lot of elements that I think are already addressed in the SASB standards, but there's certainly more that we can do there, and we're interested in hearing stakeholder feedback.
Awesome, thanks, Marvin. And if you see me glancing to the side, I'm keeping an eye on questions coming in, and thank you, lots of great questions, and did get a few around exactly what you described in terms of how we account for physical climate risk and where that shows up in our standards. So thanks for touching on that. I think we hit on that, and hopefully that answered the question for the couple folks who sent that in. Another question that we've gotten from the audience, which lines up with something I was hoping to get your perspectives on, is and really zooming in on how companies and what companies are disclosing now. I think a lot of interest from the audience to understand our perspectives around that. And so maybe Gail and Lynn, for both of you, what have you guys been observing around what we've been seeing in disclosure practices around climate risk for the industries that you cover? Maybe Lynn, we can start with you this time and then go back to Gail.
Sure, I'll be happy to share two different observations. One around more the content of what companies are disclosing, and second is more around the format and avenue that they are disclosing in. So first around the content with food and beverage company, going back to the concept of a very complex global supply chain for agriculture that's present for most of companies on the value chain. What we've been hearing a lot from companies is the importance they feel in understanding regional specificity to certain issues. So maybe sourcing, let's say, cocoa from West Africa, from like down in the Philippines, but there are distinct issues there. There may be climate issues, there may be water issues, but that regional specificity is very important. So that type of engagement context, I believe, is very important for investors to understand, not necessarily just a top line absolute number. And then the other observation that I've seen in this last year is the location that food and beverage companies are starting to disclose this information. This is a sector that is very consumer facing, and in turn there has been lots of different sustainability report, consumer facing, public stakeholder facing disclosures around sustainability efforts, which has always been encouraging, lots of great data to see. This year we're starting to see more focused communication to investors on top of that broader stakeholder engagement. So for example, we've seen ESG pages on the metrics pop up for, say, companies like McDonald's, for some retailers, where it is much more focused. Here is clearly our data, here's our progress, here is our year-to-year data. And it's something that I think investors can access much more cleanly and directly, because we hear often from investors, we know the information's there, but it may be hard to find. So I think this is a really great progress for me to see in this space on getting that information directly to the capital markets.
That's great. Yeah, and that's something I definitely hear too, that the first point that you touched on in terms of some of the challenges around the granularity of physical climate risk and how to effectively communicate that to investors. But similarly, fully agree. Great to see the progress in getting that information as clearly and as a standardized way as possible to investors so that they can incorporate into their decision making. Gail, yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so maybe taking it from a much, much higher level, I'd say the number one trend is just the interest in reporting and getting this information out there. So even smaller companies that might have been thinking about reporting for a while are really starting to take action and put information out in the market. So far and away, that's my top kind of observation. Another trend is really one that I'm seeing both from companies as well as investors, which is, we're talking, and a lot of this is oriented around risk for obvious reasons, but I'm finding more and more interest from companies that they feel that they have some positive stories to tell, and they're trying to find ways to get that out there. But also from the investor side, that they really do recognize that the companies that do come up with solutions for these problems have some significant opportunities, and they're looking for ways to identify that. So just increasing interest on that end as well. And then just an anecdote in terms of disclosure and how things are changing. Last year, a major European airline was listed as a top 10 carbon emitter, along with primarily coal companies. It garnered them a lot of attention, and the way the company elected to respond to that attention, clearly feeling that the interpretation and depiction wasn't accurate, was to start reporting their carbon emissions on an actual monthly basis and not just annually in some sort of sustainability report. So I think it just shows you just a sign of the increasing interest in having this data.
Yeah, that's a really helpful example. And I think we're seeing more and more examples of this across different industries, showing up in industry specific ways. And I think that points to where I wanted to go next. And again, this definitely a theme I'm seeing in a lot of the questions we're getting from the audience, which again, thank you, really thoughtful questions that we're getting, and definitely want to get to as many of these as we can. But a lot are centered around sort of, we know what we know now. The standards include, a lot of information around climate, but this is a dynamic issue. It continues to evolve. The evidence continues to emerge. We're seeing trends in disclosure. We're seeing growing investor interest, and just overall, our knowledge around climate change and its impacts to business is growing. And so I think there's a lot of interest in Lynn and Gail, what you're both observing in terms of emerging issues in the industries that you cover. So what are you seeing on the horizon for the industries that you cover in terms of climate related issues? And maybe Gail, we can go right back to you and hear some of your thinking around this.
Sure, and I think I'm going to hit on two things that both you and Marvin have touched on today. So one is, if you just look at the news this week, Europe is considering dramatically reducing their emission limits on transportation, on cars and trucks, and California is hoping to get to zero emission vehicles by 2035. So that is something that is either directly or explicitly in the standards, such as autos, as you noted. Companies are asked in the SASB standard to report their zero emission vehicles. But it's just worth thinking about the obvious and maybe less obvious consequences of moves like that. So you touched on some of them, that if you move to zero emission vehicles, that could start to put a lot of stress on your power grid if you haven't made commensurate changes. It's going to have serious consequences for the companies that are currently selling, refining and selling the petrol to go into those vehicles, and just a whole range of consequences that you really need to think through. So it's not just one industry; it's just thinking how these things can trickle through.
Yeah.
Another one, as Marvin indicated, is maybe some of the more direct impacts and consequences of these changes. So as I noted in forestry management, we do, at least in a qualitative way, talk about these issues, what the physical consequences of climate change are for forestry. But before joining SASB, I spent the bulk of my career as a sell-side analyst. And really, if I think about the last 5-10 years, had just been a constant stream of things where a polar vortex dramatically impacted operations. A storm came through and flooded facilities and crushed demand for a period of time. Or you weren't able to harvest trees because of the risk of forest fire. And so I think there could be some opportunity to more explicitly quantify and capture some of those impacts and standards for other industries where it isn't either directly or indirectly covered.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of examples that I'd put out there.
Love it. Yeah, no, that all definitely resonates with what I'm hearing, and I think what we're seeing in the chat as well. So Lynn, yeah, anything to add? So what are you seeing in terms of emerging issues in the food and beverage space?
Sure. From the food and beverage space, definitely back to the theme around this is a space that touches the consumers directly. I think we've seen for a long time now, like how food companies, they think about packaging, they think about your energy management, your kind of greenhouse gas and that scope 1 scale. But more and more, I think this last 2 years, we're seeing it's that consumer inherent ask of what about your product itself, and this has been really coming into play with the growth around plant-based proteins, plant-based dairies. The question on is kind of meat the way we continue to go down that route, or do we explore some alternatives? And I think similar to what Gail mentioned, there are larger and bigger value and supply chain impacts. One of my colleagues, she is really exploring this research in the area, and also encourage anyone on the line that has expertise or touch points in this to connect with us. We'd love to hear more viewpoints and understand this better. But as the conversation starts there, it then begins, well, is let's say growing soy, expanding that in new areas and potential like deforestation trade-offs. How do we grapple with that versus say meat production, that greenhouse gas emission? So there's a lot of complex, I think, questions in play as we see many companies start to look at kind of their product mix around the issue. And then the other part, interesting to note, is I think often we see climate risks as the risk part, and Gail started to touch on there's also opportunities. And when we think about agriculture and especially ingredient sourcing, a changing climate also, while it limits maybe where one region used to be able to support the growth of a certain product, it opens the door for another region because the climate has changed. One example is within the wine growing regions. An observation is right now, Napa in California in the United
Mhm.
States, you have Bordeaux in France, let's say. Both of these are water stress or water risk areas as climate is changing. However, in Europe, you're starting to look in England, that climate is starting to match for wine growing. In the United States, it's shifting over to Midwest, more northern states, Montana, Wyoming, Michigan. And you're starting to see wine start to pop up there as new industries. So I think while we're considering how we can mitigate, how we can use technology to bridge these changes in climate in existing growth regions for agriculture, there's also areas that we're looking at in terms of new opportunities. So some winners and also with kind of things we're trying to make up for.
Yeah, speaking to that adaptation piece a little bit, where there's actions that companies need to take to mitigate risk, but then we also need to adapt to what is going to occur with the changing climate. And definitely sounds like you'll both be busy with research activities related to some of these emerging issues that you've identified. So no rest for us, which is a good thing. But I think that brings me back to Marvin, wanted to ask you a question. Obviously, we have a lot of research work that's ongoing around climate and how we can account for that in our standards. And a key piece of that, of course, is going to be including stakeholder voices in our forward work. And I'm sure you get this question, I get it all the time, which is stakeholders are enthusiastic to engage in the process to help set our standards. And we, of course, welcome that. It's core to our DNA, that market engagement piece. So maybe you could just touch on a little bit more how stakeholders can get engaged in the process for folks who are listening in.
Yeah, thanks, David. And before I dive into the how, I do want to expand a little bit on that core DNA piece because getting market input is a foundational tenet of our approach to standard setting. So this isn't something that we view as a nice to have. This is essential in terms of helping guide and prioritize our research efforts. So I'll start with that call to action to the group of really just engaging with us. The short answer is reach out to us. The channels through which you can do that are you can provide sort of general feedback. So you can fill out a feedback form, reach out to an analyst, reach out to me directly. If you have feedback on either existing standards content or emerging issues that you think should be considered for future standards updates. We also have consultations throughout a project lifecycle. So this can be answering direct questions that an analyst has for a given standard setting activity, or it could be just providing feedback that can help them prioritize the research efforts. And then also we have public comment periods. So on standard setting projects through our due process, we have very specific public comment periods where, again, we welcome your feedback and we publish those comments so that the market can transparently see what our activities are and what individuals are saying about our various research efforts. So really want to invite you all to reach out to us, explore our current projects page to see what projects we might be working on that align with your expertise and experience. And please do provide us feedback. And if you're not sure the best avenue to provide specific feedback, do reach out directly to me and I'd be happy to guide you in the right direction.
Yeah, and for the questions coming in, you can find Marvin's contact information directly on our website. And please do feel free to reach out directly to him, or those project pages are key. We include the contact information of each project manager. You're welcome to reach out to them as well. Really want to make it as easy as possible, as Marvin said, for folks to engage with us. Such an important part of our process. So I have a ton of other questions I could ask, but definitely want to get to a lot of the great questions we're getting from the audience. So maybe we can just wrap up with some quick thoughts from each of you. So it seems like every year is an unprecedented year in terms of what we observe with the changing climate. I know several of us are located here on the West Coast in the United States, and certainly it has been very apparent to us the impacts of the changing climate with what we've been facing out here in terms of the fires that we've experienced. But also want to think about the opportunity for change and how we can respond and the role that capital markets can play in that. So would love to hear just quick comments from each of you in terms of how you view the capital markets as being a lever for change to respond to and put us on a path to a lower carbon future. So maybe we can start with Gail and then Lynn and then conclude with you, Marvin, and then we'll get right into questions from the audience. So Gail, would love to hear any of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's a wide range. I mean, some are very direct. So in marine, there's a relatively new initiative called the Poseidon Principles, where banks are committing to track the carbon emissions of their loan portfolios for marine operations. And clearly, presumably, that's something that they would look at and consider as they're financing projects moving forward. There's growth in things like green bonds. I think I saw a headline in the last week or two talking about not so much a benefit for being green, but more about a cost surcharge if you're, quote, perceived as brown. Mm-hmm. So there's some pretty direct ones, but I'd say from my interactions with both companies and investors, I think the biggest one is really just communicating. I don't know if companies fully appreciate how much the markets really do care and think about these issues. And I think having that conversation will help guide management decisions, maybe give them greater confidence to do things that might have a longer time horizon. Mm-hmm. So I really think a lot of it just boils down to having those conversations and understanding what those trade-offs are in terms of minimizing the risks or being able to invest in new opportunities.
Perfect. Thanks, Gail. How about you, Lynn? Any thoughts to add there?
Yeah, Gail ended on exactly the point I wanted to raise, which is I don't think it's specific for food and beverage, but really holistic for all industries, is that investor interest, the communication, the engagements around it, it really can drive change. Can share an example. Recently, we touched point with a poultry producer in the United States, and they recently disclosed to the SASB standards. It was their first time. And the journey began with investor engagements and with shareholder resolution for them to disclose to SASB. So it was an ask on disclosure to SASB, but along the way, they started looking at the topics and specifically around greenhouse gas emissions. And this wasn't something they had been tracking actively, and in turn has now build up the data to disclose, and furthermore is discussing, well, what are our next step strategies to manage this more strategically within our company. So I think that for me, it's super encouraging, especially to hear of these stories. It's that disclosure, it isn't the end all, but it's kind of the beginning to cascade and build on more management around ESG issues. And I think that's the tremendous value, like these investor engagements really started off. And what's been really positive to hear is that the investors are also looping back with them, sharing their feedback on what they have disclosed and continuing to guide the conversations on further areas of focus.
That's great, Lynn. Yeah, just creating that common language, bringing everyone along, really getting folks talking about these issues in a different way that can foster and drive positive change. Definitely love that. And Marvin, maybe we'll end with your thoughts here, and then we'll dive right into these questions coming in from the audience. Just want to say, these questions are great, so thank you to the audience. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But yeah, anyway, Marvin, without further ado.
Yeah, I'll be brief so we can dive into those questions. But I really just think capital markets can play an important role in the absence of regulation. But they can't do that unless they have good, comparable information that companies can share. And in cases where there is strong regulation, I think the efforts that companies are taking to address climate concerns can be accelerated. And we've touched on a little bit on how our standards show that. And the apparel example that I provided was one where we do touch on those issues. So for me, the capital markets play a really key role, regardless of the regulatory environment.
Thanks, Marvin. Totally agree. Data can drive things. And the more effective we can make it, the better. So let's jump into some of the questions we're getting from the audience. And I've tried to consolidate some of them into common questions to hit as much as we can, but there's a lot here that we can jump into. I think one of the first ones that I saw come in from several folks is an interest to understand, how investors are using this information and sort of going from the company reporting the data to investor use of the data. So I know, Gail, this is something you've thought about quite a bit. So any comments you have around this, different ways that investors are utilizing ESG data and how that informs decision making?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one broad trend is one towards integrating it into the investment process. This does not replace fundamental analysis, but these aren't black and white easy issues. There are lots of shades of gray and decision making and judgment values that one would need to make, just as with evaluating any other more traditional financial information. But there's an increasing trend of just purely integrating this, so making sure that people are considering this information into their investment process. And then different firms certainly taking very, very different approaches. So some are perhaps just giving that information to make sure that investment teams incorporate it, and two portfolio managers at a single shop could come out to totally different conclusions based on how they rank and value that input. Others are creating their own proprietary rating systems and putting their own kind of firm-wide judgment on how to weight these different issues. And so coming up with their own internal ratings. And then probably one that's transcends all of this is just using it for engagement. So going back to what Lynn and I were talking about before, but understanding what the important issues are, so then you can discuss it with management to understand if they have a strategy to address and are ahead of addressing some of the challenges ahead, or recognizing some of the opportunities that they can pursue. So those would be some of the key trends that I would see.
That's great. Yeah, no, thank you, Gail. I think a couple other questions I've seen, some common themes. One, what should companies do if they are looking at the SASB standard and they don't see a metric that they think is important for them to report? I think the short answer is report it. If you think that there is a piece of information that investors need to know and the SASB standard doesn't have it, by all means report it. The SASB standards are really meant to be that basis of information that's broadly applicable to companies within an industry. But of course, the company is ultimately who determines what is financially material and what should be reported. We're just hoping that the standard can provide a common language. Another question that we've gotten a couple times is sort of this idea of cost effectiveness, and how do we think about this balance between decision usefulness and getting investors the information that they need. And then, of course, in collecting and reporting that data, there's a cost to companies. And so I know this is something that is built into our DNA in the form of our conceptual framework, how we approach our standards, but maybe Lynn or Gail, any experience or kind of anecdotes you want to share around this, how we think about in our standard setting, balancing cost effectiveness and decision usefulness and how that gets incorporated. So maybe Lynn, any quick comments you have in your experience working with stakeholders, developing our standards?
Sure, happy to give that a shot. I think a lot of this actually goes back to what Marvin has said, that stakeholder engagement is a core part of how we do our work. We recognize, Gail covers many sectors and industries she shared. For me, it's the entire food value chain. Neither of us will know any of the industries as intimately as all the one of you at companies in these industries as subject matter experts. So for us, is based on our research, our engagement, we certainly do our best to factor that into the development of our metrics and technical protocol based on our understanding of this is the wide known industry practice around these issues, or this is the feasible go-to, let's say like third-party certification or standard that industry has coalesced. However, we recognize we're not perfect. This isn't necessarily we always get it right 100% of the time. So that's where that feedback loop is really helpful for us. We really love it when we engage with companies after they implement, share with us, this metric was really hard to gather data for, or this one, it was a bit tricky, or this one made absolute sense. That type of feedback loop is immensely helpful for us, and we factor that into how we continue to improve our standards. So encourage anyone to engage with us, as Marvin's mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember fondly lots of conversations exactly like that that I had when focusing on the oil and gas industry standards. And there really is that balance between, wanting to align as much as possible with the information that companies are gathering and that they're making management decisions based on, and then trying to find what is most useful for investors in their decision-making process. And, what's interesting about our process is we really create that forum that you described where these voices can come together and we can try to get to consensus on what the right things are to measure, taking into account all of these different factors. Just looking at the questions that are coming in, maybe another area that we can dive into, Gail, is, we started to get into some disclosure examples on the panel, and folks are really really interested in sort of more of your observations around what we're seeing with disclosure and particularly what effective disclosure looks like. So any additional comments from you on sort of this idea around how we can increasingly make disclosure effective?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one, just to make clear, we don't, as SASB, mandate a specific format for disclosure. We do put a lot of criteria around the data that's actually being reported. So just with that clear, my number one piece of advice is to engage with stakeholders and understand what it is that they want, and that you're providing information that is applicable to your stakeholders. Now, that said, from the conversations I've had as stakeholders, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. These aren't black and white issues. Most investors do recognize that. And so they want the data, and they want the data to be reported in a consistent, comparable way. But they also do realize that you need context on that. And I think that came out a lot in the example that David gave at the beginning with the two companies. And you could look at a single number and it might seem similar, but when you start digging in, things are very different. Or it could be a situation where your emissions might be a little bit high, but your product helps your customers reduce their emissions dramatically. And people generally want that context. So I would tend to say, to be able to give the numbers in a usable format and structure that's consistent, also potentially some comparable or history of that data, but also to be able to give access to that context so people can understand how they should be interpreting some of that data for your specific company.
Awesome. Thank you, Gail. Well, I think we're getting towards the top of the hour here, so we'll probably need to move to wrap up here. Apologies to those questions we didn't get to. Lots of great questions. We really appreciate those coming in. And Gail, Marvin, Lynn, thank you so much for joining us and unpacking a lot of this interesting information around climate and the SASB standards with the audience here today. Just to conclude, go to the next slide, and sort of ending on this idea, this sort of sense of urgency around the need for climate action and the important role that capital markets play in getting us on that 1.5 degree pathway. You know, I've had the opportunity here to talk a little bit about the role that SASB can play in this transition, but of course, we're just one piece of the puzzle, and ultimately it's going to take many actors to put us on that path. Companies, investors, governments, the decisions of all of us as individuals. And thankfully, we have weeks like this that allow us to really focus in on finding solutions and the contributions and the role and the responsibility that we all have to get us on that pathway. And we're just so appreciative of all of your willingness to join us, to spend an hour of your valuable time with us, focusing in here on the role that SASB can play within this broader narrative. So just wanted to end on mentioning a few resources for those that want to learn more and continue to dive into the world of SASB, which we would welcome you and invite you to do. You can, of course, download the standards themselves. For this group that you've talked to, we are very much immersed in the standards, so we point you to that first, and definitely welcome feedback as you're diving into those. For companies that are getting started on reporting using the SASB standards, you can access our implementation primer. Great resource for folks who are getting started or at any point along their disclosure journey. Our materiality map is a great visual introduction to the standard. It shows all 77 industries and each of the disclosure topics and metrics. And then finally, we're really excited about our upcoming annual SASB symposium later this year, which will be moving to a virtual platform. Certainly, if you found this content interesting or helpful, the SASB Symposium is just a great forum to dive deeper, to hear perspectives of leading companies, investors, and subject matter experts. I'm incredibly excited for it, and I hope that you'll all be able to join us for that really important event later this year. And with that, we're at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and conclude the session. Thank you all again for joining. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in touch. And we wish you all the best and take care. Thank you.